Okay, so we are doing particles today, and basically a particle system, it's pretty easy. If you have like an object up here, there's this like tab that looks like stars, and here's where you add particles. And if you just click new, it'll default add some settings for you, and if you hit play, we have a particle system. So this is when it's set to emitter, so you're emitting like stars or drops of water or something, but there's also, you can switch it to hair, and these are also particles, and I need that haircut. But anyways, today we're just going to focus on like the emission type particles, and like I've used this type for if you want to make snow or something coming down. This guy, some of his art, he just uses particles to make really cool art. So I was thinking we should try to make something kind of cool today, and just play around with particles and force fields, and see if, because this is really an exercise in like lighting and force fields. His computer is probably way more powerful than ours, so he has like probably 1 million particles there, and we might only have like 50,000. But particles are cool because you can get a lot of objects on the screen, and it shouldn't slow your computer down too much. Where did my so like something you might use it for, instead of just, so you could use it for snow, but you could also use it for, like, let's say you had a wet ground and you have a ball that hits the ground. You can have this little like spurt of particles, and when you render it out, you can set it so that the emission object is invisible, but now we have like some particles spraying out. For the most part, particles don't react to, like, they don't bounce off each other. You can sometimes get them to like clump together as if they're a fluid, but a particle like can't knock another particle over. You can get them to bounce off of like a ground, but in a way you're kind of limited with what particles can do, but they're very useful. And yeah, so let's just kind of go through the settings real quick. So it doesn't matter what you start with. Well, it does matter, but when you're learning, let's just start with a cube, for example. And remember, you go to that little star setting and you hit new system, and you only see the particles once you hit the play button. So now we have some particles, and you could just leave this playing the whole time, and if it's playing and you start adjusting some of the settings, you'll see it update in real time. But if you pause it and start updating settings, you don't see it updating in real time. Notice how down here there's like a dark red line. And if I change a setting, that means it's cached into the computer, so it's going to play smoothly. But if I change the number of particles just by 1, it's no longer cached into the system. All those particles disappear, and they're starting up there. It's going to act a little strange, like a big clump jumped out. So whenever you change the system, you want to go back to the beginning and hit play, and it refreshes your computer. Sometimes you'll get into a situation where it's like, you're trying to update settings and you can't get it to clean its cache. So if you just change the particle by 1 and then change it back, it'll like update, and then you can go back to the, so that dark red solid line is worth paying attention to. So here's some of the settings. It's like, you want the particles to start emitting on frame 1 and end at 200. Usually you want them to start later in the animation. So like you could say, I want them to emit starting at frame 50 and end at 55. And we're going to have 1001 particles do that. So when I hit play, you'll see, boom, there's 50, and it ended at 55. The reason the animation lasts longer, this part, is because the lifetime of the particles is 50 frames. So they stop emitting like right there, and then we still have to basically simulate for another 50 frames. So if I bump this up to like 200, now it'll simulate the whole thing. If we zoom out, there they go, and they're still going and still going, and pretty soon they'll disappear because we have clipping set, but they're still going. So we have this lifetime, you have the start and end, and then you also have random. So like, let's say our lifetime is only 10 seconds. Sometimes if it's like snow or whatever, it kind of looks weird if they all start kind of disappearing at the same time. So you can set this random lifetime so they'll kind of like twinkle away. Let's set the lifetime to be like 30, and I set the random amount, so it's the random lifetime. And they should kind of like twinkle away like glitter or something. Now, most of the time you don't want them just falling. So some really great settings are, if you scroll down to the bottom, you have field weights. And if you turn off, in field weights, we're going to start putting like force fields and stuff. And like, let's say you had a complex scene and you had, a vortex force field that's creating a spinning motion, influencing like a smoke simulation. But if you didn't want it to influence these particles, you could turn down the vortex to 0. But there's also a gravity slider. So if I say I don't want gravity, and then let's set our start frame at 1, these should just start kind of like floating out, and we'll increase the lifetime a bit. They just start floating out of the cube. Now, what's pushing them? There's no gravity. Where's the force coming from? Well, right here in velocity, so back toward the top, we're seeing it's emitting from faces, and it's coming out in a random spot in the face, and it's kind of an even distribution. The reason it's being pushed out is this normal, this emitter geometry. Normal is set to 1, which means the direction of your faces are the normals. You can see normals by going here. So like the blue lines are what this cube's normals are. If we had let's see if I ruin this by adding a sphere. So the normals of this sphere are going to give us a different, a different kind of emission. So now they're emitting from the normals of the sphere. There's no gravity, so they go in all different directions. If you set the normal to 0, they'll just like kind of clump up there. And yeah, they're just clumping up there. So let's set that back to 1. So one thing I notice I need often is like, sometimes it's too, like, we'll have the emission start at 1 and end at 2. Like, it's too uniform in a way. You almost can like see the geometry of that sphere. So instead of emitting it from faces, you can emit it from the volume, and you can see there's like a ton in there, and it starts giving it a different look. You can also turn off even distribution, and you just want variety, I think, in particles. There might be cases where you want it to look very geometric. Like, let's say we have a cube, and we create a new emission system, and we have them all emitting at 1, and they're in the volume. So, like, let's say we wanted to do grid. Let's see. So here, there we go. So this could like look kind of cool if you made each one of those particles like a cube or something. It could look like a mainframe or so anyways, that's with grid. If you do random volume, they're in there. And this is how I did the animation of these stars for the Star Trek clip. This first animation, it's a picture of stars in the background, and then there's probably like 50 particles in a volume, and the camera is like flying through those stars like that. And this is what it looks like. There's a particle there's there. But the far background is just a picture. So that's kind of a useful thing to have volume. Okay, so let's get to force fields now. So as you can see, it's pretty easy to add a particle system. I think since I've already created some particle systems, like I haven't been labeling them, but for example, the last one, I can go to those settings. You know, it was emitting at 1, and I had just turned it to random. So if you want to add the same particle system, I'll call this like poof. If you want to add the same particle system to a new object, you create new, and you can go to your drop-down menu and say poof, and then we have our poof animation. It's kind of like materials that way. Like if you make a material, you can do that drop-down menu. But the force field, so I'm just going to make a new setting, and I'm going to call this like wavy. And we will have it, I'm going to set the animation length to be like 120. So I can have the end of the emissions be at 120. I can have the lifetime be at 120 because I want to see these particles throughout the whole time. And we have emitter geometry at 1. Let's have it coming out of the volume just to give it maybe some variety. And I'll scroll down and turn down the gravity. So now we have some particles. Okay, so if you do Shift A, you can add a force field, and you have to make sure that the force field is on the same layer as your particles. So like I'm on layer 2 now. Here's layer 1, layer 2. If I add a force field here, this turbulence is a really good one to add. Like nothing's happening. You know, you end up turning up the strength of the turbulence. Still nothing's happening. But as soon as you move it to layer 1, you'll start seeing you'll see them like scatter. So this would be cool for like a hive of insects or whatever. I don't know. I feel like I can see this in a sci-fi movie, like an irritated hive of aliens. Okay. So what does this force field thing do? So I think for particles, it's cool to add a turbulence just because it gives you, I'm on the same layer. And right now, it's not doing anything. So you click that little empty. This doesn't show up in your render. And over here, there's like a ball bouncing. It's supposed to look like a ball bouncing sign. This is like your physics tab. And we have a force field selected. And so you have to turn up the strength of this force field. Like 10 should be enough. And we start seeing like some interesting behavior. Maybe we should do like 5. So the size of it, I think when it's 0, it just does a default size. But 1, setting it to 1 means this is like 1 unit from here to here. So if we set the size to 1, the waves of the turbulence are going to be kind of within that 1 unit. So like let's set it to 10. So it'll be like 10 of those units. So we'll be getting like some pretty big. Yeah, so they're being pushed all along one way. So just you guys can look through some of these. Another cool one is like harmonic, which it'll like draw your particles in. So that's kind of neat. You can also to do the same effect, you can choose force and give it a strength of like -5. And then that draws it in. But if you go to render this, you won't see your particles. Well, actually, in Blender Render you will. If you go in cycles, you won't see them. So how do you make them visible? If it were a snowflake or something, you could go to another layer, and let's say you have a snowflake made. This will be our snowflake. With your particle selected, go to your particle settings and you scroll to display, or no, in the render settings, since I'm just want my snowflake object, I go to object, and it was a plane that I made. I could have named it snowflake, and now I see all those planes are coming out of the emitter. It looks kind of bad because they're all like lined up the same. But you have a rotation tab where if you open the drop-down menu, you can add some dynamic movement to it. So now they're like they're like spinning. You can add some randomness to how they're emitted. And now it's starting to look okay, and if I render it, I can see the plane. So when you don't have anything selected, by default it's on halo, and these points are basically just telling you where whatever object you assign is going to appear. Now let's say you want a bunch of different variations of snowflakes. So like you have a snowflake that looks like this, and then maybe you have an icosphere. It's always good to keep in mind you want your particles to be very low poly. Like this icosphere is, and setting it to a subdivision of 1 is a good one. You can even smooth shade it. And then let's say I have a cube. So we have 3 different objects. If I hold shift and select all of them and then say Control G, I make a group, and I'll call these like snowflakes, and I'm just labeling it down here in the last operator tab. Create. So now when I go over here and click the particles, instead of choosing object and choosing that plane, I'm going to choose group and use my snowflake groups. And now I see I have like cubes, and I have planes, and the little icosphere. And you can assign different materials to the plane, cube, and icosphere, and then when it renders, you'll see each one of these will have like different materials. I'm going to set this to sun and like just darken it. So yeah, you're getting some interesting stuff. Here's just a little animation I made. Let's see if just as a test, I was trying to emulate that guy, and I think this was not a great result. I mean, what I like about it is this glowing, it's coming out of a glowing like sphere, but anyways, they have personality. So right now, let's just open up Blender, and you guys just play around with the settings, and then we'll meet up in a second and see kind of what you guys made.